Hello and welcome to the Make It Conscious podcast. This is episode 5, and this episode is all about cults, exploitative cults, exploitative situations, a topic that affects many people. I might even dare say everybody. I think the cult phenomenon, whilst we think of it as being something associated with spirituality and religion and weird rituals and this kind of thing, actually at its core, these exploitative codependent dynamics permeate culture, in my opinion. And I'm going to talk about the ways in which that is happening. Likewise, if you are a person who acknowledges that you have indeed been in a cult at some point, of course, this episode may be of use to you. If you don't believe that about yourself, you don't feel you've been part of an exploitative group, I would encourage you to listen with an open mind and see if anything changes your opinion on that. Because the principles of cult dynamics are, on one hand, psychological. They're nothing to do with religion. They are to do with our own mind's wiring. And secondly, cults are way more common than most people think. And actually, many people have been involved in a cult, often without even realizing that what they were part of was precisely a cult in terms of my definition. It involved exploitative dynamics. It involved codependency and manipulation and all the things we're going to be getting into here. But really the aim of this episode is to provide that information, provide that education around what really is going on with a cult. Let's make sense of cult dynamics. It's also to help you recognize the signs so that you can navigate daily situations and discern between exploitative cults and healthy functional groups that are doing good things in the world. So it's going to be the first in a mini series, if you like. We're going to be talking about cults today, and then we're going to be talking more about narcissism, which is a key part of understanding cult dynamics. And also we're going to be talking about the methods that cults use in subsequent episodes. But today, we're just going to be answering the question, what exactly is a cult? If I ask you to imagine a cult, what images come up for you? Do you imagine crowds of acolytes in white robes performing some kind of ritual? Do you think of the likes of the People's Temple, the cult headed up by Jim Jones, where nearly 1,000 people lost their lives? Do you think of Heaven's Gate, Marshall Applewhite's cult, where I think 30 or 40 people lost their lives in a mass suicide? I think if you ask most people, that is more along the lines of the kind of thing that comes up when you think of a cult. But the truth is that cults generally don't look like cults. A cult can be any group that involves a codependent dynamic between its leader and its members, and is designed with the intention to provide that leader with a perpetual source of attention, validation, admiration, as a way to help them regulate an unresolved trauma. Going in there quite early with some pretty deep definitions here. We'll get onto all of this in detail, but for now, understand that this stereotype of cults is largely inaccurate. In fact, codependent dynamics in group situations have existed as long as civilization itself, and its roots have nothing to do with religion per se. It's really about psychology. And so even as people in the West have become less and less interested in religion and the symbols of religion, the cult phenomenon, if anything, seems to have worsened, and is certainly taking on new forms. And this is testament to that first point, that this really isn't about spirituality exactly. It's about something that's being tapped into in the minds of people. And cults today are finding many ways of reaching people, and they exist in many forms, and they are tapping into and leveraging the needs of people's unconscious minds in a way that organized religion used to and is doing less and less now. If you remember back in episode 2, I talked about religion and the unconscious mind, and how religion, as much as it used to meet certain needs of people's unconscious minds, it didn't understand that that's what it was doing. And as people have thrown out religion, in the West at least, over the last 150 years or so, other things have come in to fill the gap. Not least materialist science, but also new and spurious ways of engaging with their unconscious mind. And this actually is a large part of what's giving us the cult phenomenon today, and how cults of all kinds are now reaching people. Not just religious cults, but self-help cults, commercial cults, political cults. We're going to get into the various kinds of cults in a few moments. But first, let's just set the scene by dispelling 3 myths about cults. I've alluded to these already. Myth 1 is that cults look like cults. Now, of course, no one really knowingly joins a cult, right? Cults always look wholesome from the outside. They have to in order to recruit people. And so even though their real intention is to create a source of narcissistic supply for the leader, to prop up a grandiose vision, of course they have to conceal that. They have to conceal their real intentions with something that looks very unculty on the surface. So there is virtually no cult in existence that will straight up claim to be a cult, that's for sure, but that even looks like what we might think of that stereotypical cult on the surface. And when you're in a cult, you generally don't believe you're in a cult until you've actually been through a serious amount of conflict and maybe even a clash with the cult and or its leader. You're unlikely to admit to yourself you're in a cult. In fact, no one really believes they're in a cult right, up until that point. And there are countless healthy, non-exploitative groups around the world who are sharing beneficial practices, spiritual or financial. And it would be unfortunate if these groups weren't given the light of day because people became too cautious, too careful about the existence of exploitative groups. So much the same way as today, there's a lot of talk about narcissism and toxicity in relationships. And a lot of people are going to the other extreme and arming up against narcissism and going online to talk about how bad and terrible and wrong narcissists are. And I don't disagree with much of that stuff, but it doesn't actually serve to fully integrate an encounter like that. And in then becoming extra suspicious and hateful and keeping all those unresolved feelings, it then becomes possible to sort of shut oneself down and not even enter into a healthy relationship. And in much the same way, we all need community, right? We all need to belong to some kind of group. And as much as we need to be discerning, very discerning, I would add, we also need to be receptive to the virtues of other groups that exist out there. So this talk is really intended to help you in that pursuit of discerning the difference between cults and healthy groups. So just as today's cults are learning from the horror stories of yesterday, the likes of People's Temple and so on, Nexium, this kind of thing, they are learning from these things in order to upgrade their camouflage. And I have first-hand experience of this in a modern-day digital cult, which I will describe in a moment, where some of the tactics of camouflage and exploitation were very, very subtle. And if we are calibrating our own receptors to the cults of yesterday and what they merely look like, then we leave ourselves exposed to what the cults of today and the cults of tomorrow are really doing. So if you know me by now, you know that I tend to prefer to get to the core principles of things as opposed to merely look at the observational features of a thing. In the last episode, I talked about empathy, and of course I looked at what empathy looks like on the surface, but then I described the essence of empathy and what it really is. And in a similar way here, I want to get to the heart of what a cult really is at its core, so that you can then go and understand the principles of that and see those principles playing out without necessarily seeing the overt signs of people behaving as a sort of caricature of an exploitative cult. That's not going to be very helpful in this day and age and going forward. So we would do well to upgrade our detection. Myth 2, only certain kinds of people join a cult, right? Oh, only gullible people join a cult, right? Only ignorant people join a cult. Oh, well, if we're holding those kinds of judgments, then I might suggest that we're actually leaving ourselves exposed to the kinds of manipulation that leads people to join a cult. One day, one might find themselves in a cult and not even realize it. Let's say, for example, we think that only naive people would join a cult. Not like us, right? Well, if we identify as non-naive, as wise and discerning, and that's how we like to be seen by others, we're going to be attracted to things that look like that wisdom, right? That look like experience. What do you think these cults are offering, right? They are offering precisely that. They're offering something that looks like the opposite of naivete. And if we don't want to be seen as naive, we'll be attracted to something that looks like just the thing we need. Now, it doesn't mean that anyone is naive, right? This is just a left brain label that doesn't actually reflect reality as it really is. All of these things exist in all of us, and by making them conscious, we can actually use them and not be blindsided by them. So it wouldn't really be fair to say that anyone is naive or any of those judgments. They can behave in that way, perhaps. Again, it's really just a way of thinking about it. But it would be rather preposterous to assume that people would be just born, right, with all these qualities, just fully integrated out of the womb and not have to go through and learn these things. The truth is that there's no certain kind of person that joins a cult. And as I've said, I think that many, many people have belonged to a cult, or maybe are even in one, if we use our expanded definition and get to the principles, and not even realize it. So every person has an unconscious mind, and we don't really choose what is in our unconscious mind. So a cult leader or a narcissist may well play on the fact that we are responsible for our minds, but take that to the point where that means that they can do anything they like to you and not take responsibility for it, right? Wonderful. If you're responsible for your mind and what's in your unconscious mind, then I can do anything to it, right? And it doesn't incriminate me in any way. No, that is somewhat fallacious. We don't choose what's in our unconscious mind. We don't decide to push away naivete, for example. We don't choose to want to be seen as wise or holy, right? These are things that are conditioned in us at a very early age in response to childhood conditions. But here's the thing, we can take responsibility for it when it arises. So, getting nuanced here about what we really mean. We can do something about it. And until we make the unconscious conscious, until we understand what is driving our decisions day to day, we will continue to operate out of those deep-rooted patterns. The conscious ego will tell a story, it will make it seem like everything's making sense, but really, the unconscious is involved. And going through these kinds of experiences is a sometimes necessary way to really understand ourselves, understand what's in our unconscious mind, do something about it. So this fact doesn't give others the right to manipulate us through our unconscious mind, but it does mean we can use these situations to take responsibility for our mind. So truth is, anyone can get involved in a cult, and anyone can and does get strung along by their unconscious mind. In many ways, the journey of life is to continue making that conscious. Myth number 3. People affected by cults should just leave and move on. Right? It's easy, right? You know it's a cult now. You know that the leader was a narcissist. You know it was exploitative. Hey, just leave. Just put it behind you. Go, gone, done. That's it. And friends and family might perpetuate this myth. But this actually is a kind of coping mechanism, I think, to avoid actually doing the work of recovery. If someone is part of a cult, that is part of their experience. That is part of their journey. It doesn't mean they are bad or wrong in any way. And if we find ourselves wanting to just bury it, just brush it under the rug, forget about it, then it suggests maybe there's still a kind of judgment there about oneself and getting into the experience. So neither leaving a cult nor moving on from a cult are as simple as just flicking a switch. To really make a full, proper recovery, it's necessary to have a plan and do the emotional work and the integration. If you don't do that, it will leave you conflicted and liable to repeat a similar situation again in future. So, most adults can relate to this fact of going through patterns in life, experiencing similar occurrences, but with a different flavor, with a different theme, time and time again in their life. And once it's happened 3 or 4 times, perhaps, if you're practicing taking responsibility for your mind and self-awareness, like actually cultivate the intention to look into your own mind and see what's going on, then you would arrive at insight through those experiences. A cult experience is no different. As much as a full recovery is absolutely possible, I would say even inevitable with the right attitude and the right approach. There is a fix, but it's not a quick fix. It requires a plan, it requires insight, and it requires integration of the experience. But by honoring the experience fully, rather than pushing it away, you can actually use it to integrate and develop beyond what is possible whilst belonging to an exploitative cult. So it can actually help act as a vehicle for a person to evolve spiritually and personally. But nonetheless, being part of a cult can actually provide a lot of valuable lessons. So in getting to really what a cult is in principle, I think it's important to understand codependency and what it really is. Because typically we might call a situation codependency merely when we see those extreme, arbitrary observations. Like maybe when a relationship breaks down, or there's a lot of arguing, or ends, right? And then maybe one or both people end up getting into another codependent relationship not long after. If we can actually understand the principles, then we can do something about that and do so much sooner. So the way I think of codependency in terms of what it is essentially is any situation where 2 or more people are unconsciously using each other to regulate their own unresolved psychological conflict whilst neglecting to take responsibility for it themselves. So this is where a relationship is, rather than being a situation where both people can practice love and sacrifice and learning, making the unconscious conscious, seeing the relationship as a dynamic in which they can work on themselves in that way and therefore facilitate the other's growth and have them facilitate our growth, it's actually a kind of elaborate coping mechanism. So there's unresolved feelings, possibly even trauma of some kind, usually relating back to early childhood, a massive shadow material. And unconsciously, we then become attracted to certain people that provide us with the opportunity to integrate that shadow material if we choose to take it. But because the knowledge of the unconscious, the knowledge of psychology and how the mind really works is pretty sparse in modern society, what tends to happen instead is people just using each other to regulate unresolved conflict, which they're actually not taking responsibility for themselves. So wanting other people to make us happy, right? To provide the conditions that please us so that we don't have to go near the things that we don't want to go near. Well, it's inevitable that will break down eventually. It's just a matter of when, not if. Because those unresolved feelings have to rear their head at some point. The world will move and shift in a way that forces that to happen. And so this kind of dynamic, this kind of relationship is actually pervasive in modern society. We kind of think it's normal. It's something we are fed by the media, right? This fairy tale idea of finding, the perfect person who will stay that way permanently and just make us happily ever after. And it pervades not just relationships, but families, friendship circles, and workplaces. And of course, it exists to varying degrees. But at its core, what it is this using other people as a way to regulate our own unresolved conflict, which we would rather not go near. And as I described in a previous episode, essentially what this is a materialist approach to relationships, because it kind of hangs off the idea that if we can just make the world just so, if we can just manipulate the world to be a certain way permanently, which to my knowledge has never been achieved ever in anything, but if we can just make it just right, then we'll be okay, right? So if we just find the right person that matches us, then we don't have to do anything. We can just sit back and allow them to make us happy. And this, of course, stands in the way of true connection. And true connection is only really possible where both people are willing to step up and be transformed by the relationship and step into that role of helping the other transform as well. But it's a two-way interaction. That's what true connection is. It's not possible if we're just exerting our will on other people. So a little bit now on my own cult story, and I consider myself to have belonged to multiple cults. And as I say here, this may be as much a reflection of society and my sensitivity to what is happening, and my expanded definitions, which I've just run through, as it is of my unique proclivities. So, I've had to do a lot of work to understand what has drawn me to each of these situations, but I don't think I'm especially unusual. Maybe, I've been in more cults than most people, but I've unconsciously sought them out as a way to integrate aspects of myself that I needed to integrate. That all said, there's 3 main cults here that I'm going to just talk about briefly. They were a digital marketing cult, which I was part of in 2014 and 2015, a business cult, which I was part of for the subsequent 2 years, and a Buddhist cult, which I was part of for a couple of years between 2019 and 2021. So on the surface, none of them look like cults, okay? The Buddhist cult is, I believe, looking more and more like a cult every day as the true intentions of the leader are slowly becoming realized by many more people. But certainly the first 2, so digital marketing cult was a group which was really purporting to be selling digital marketing education. And there was also a referral scheme as part of that. So you'd sign up, you'd be sold this dream of living the laptop lifestyle and learning all the skills you need to make money online. Very, very emotive. Lots of imagery of palm trees on desert islands. The leader doing a video from his pedalo in Mauritius, for example. And in reality, what it was a multi-level marketing scheme. At least it was. They would argue that it wasn't an MLM because it only had sort of 2 layers, but essentially it was a direct marketing scheme. So they worked very hard to not look like a pyramid scheme or a multi-level marketing scheme, but essentially, what was happening was it was really 95% about the referral scheme and 5% about education. And not only that, but there was all the hallmarks of a cult, including the leader's behavior, the gaslighting, the manipulative communication, all this stuff. The business cult was a much smaller group. So this was a business that I was a leader in, but I wasn't the cult leader. I was the partner of the cult leader. And this was a guy that I worked with for a couple of years in a corporate job, who I then went into business with. And over time, it became very, very clear that he wasn't in the slightest bit trustworthy. And by the end, he was stealing money and he was lying about money and all this kind of stuff and did all kinds of shady things. He left me as a director. So he wasn't actually a director of the business because there were certain benefits associated with that for investing purposes and for tax purposes and this kind of thing. So he was involved in all these kinds of schemes, and he wanted the rights of being a director, but not the responsibilities of being a director. And this is kind of the thing with narcissists. They sort of like want to be a bit like, Schrodinger's con man. It's like, I could be this or I could be that. It's like, you can't have it both ways. Sorry, and then the resultant sort of resistance to take responsibility and all this kind of stuff. So that was a hard lesson for me. This was a guy that was 20 years or so older than me, who I think saw an opportunity in the young version of me and didn't actually anticipate what actions I would take as a result of that. So it was nonetheless a cult. It was in the end purely made with the intention of creating narcissistic supply for this guy, not actually to build a business at all. So after some time, a year or so of thinking, God, this is really hard to build a business with this guy. Like, does he actually really want to build a business? He's actually kind of just making it harder than it would be on my own. And Of course, that's because he wasn't actually interested in building a business primarily. That was secondary and merely a means of attaining what he really wanted, which was just attention, validation, all this sort of stuff. So that's that. Finally, the Buddhist cult. Now, I talk about this one in greater depth in the ebook, which I recently launched, which is called the Cult Recovery Guide. So maybe I'll just give a short intro here, but this was essentially a Buddhist-inspired cult based out of Chiang Mai in Thailand, but really it was an online digital cult. But my initial involvement with it came when I, sort of in the aftermath of the aforementioned business cult, took a trip to Asia, went to Thailand, decided to get deeper into my spiritual practice and really devote myself to that for some time. I went along to an innocent-looking meditation meetup, which turned out to be a Buddhist meditation meetup, and ended up getting quite close to the teacher and thinking I was learning, and I was new to understanding the intricacies of Buddhism at that time. And as time went on, things clearly weren't what they purported to be. And I realized that he was actually sharing a lot of things that didn't match up with Buddhist teaching, but not only that, he was misunderstanding them and misrepresenting them in support of a grandiose vision of himself. So he actually ended up claiming to be the new Buddha, and also implying beyond any shadow of ambiguity that he had been Jesus in a past life. So, one has to ask questions there. And I did a bit of research into the guy, and it turns out he had a history of con artistry. And it was quite clear that as time went on, he was lying to me about certain things, or at least not being upfront and honest. And it was quite evident that he didn't have my best interests at heart, and he only was interested in supporting his own grandiose vision. So there came a clash at some point where I kind of forced him to show his hand and reveal whether he really cared about my well-being and others' well-being, or whether he really cared about upholding his own fantasies. And unsurprisingly, it was the latter. I then left that, but that was a very difficult departure because I had learned, or thought I'd learned, so much about Buddhism and was using some of what he had taught as the principles for navigating my own life and eliminating the suffering in my own mind. But it transpired that really a lot of what we were taught was merely repression and, cutting things off and pushing them away. It wasn't really about integration of unconscious contents. He even said himself one time that he didn't believe in therapy because, they would try to get him to talk about what had happened in the past. And it's like, well, if you want to integrate an experience, then that is a pretty valuable way of doing it, in my opinion. So I had to do a lot of learning after that departure. I probably earned the equivalent of a master's degree in Buddhism in the year that followed, and really had to find my own way. This was really a time of leaping to a point where I only trusted my own guidance, my own gut, my own judgment, taking on inspiration from others, but not sacrificing even an ounce of my own self-sovereignty and making that contingent on the thoughts, speech, and actions of other people. And this is a quality of cult leaders, is that no matter what they say, what they actually want is for the followers to give up their own self-sovereignty and project it onto them. They encourage this process of participation mystique, where you're actually experiencing something that's inside of you, your own inner numinous archetypes, the sage, Christ, the mother perhaps, or the father, and you're projecting that onto this other character. So kind of inherent to a cult's workings is a misunderstanding of the unconscious mind and how it really works. Because really what they're saying is, I'm the point, I'm the leader, I'm the grandiose savior. It has nothing to do with you or what's inside of you, right? It's not mythical, it's literal, and it's me. Which experience tells us time and time again that by all means hang out with that idea if you really need to, if that's what it takes to realize the truth of it. But ultimately, the reality will fly back in your face. And it'll be a very difficult projection withdrawal, but it may also be the most powerful and the most valuable projection withdrawal you ever have to go through. Because if you no longer have to project your inner Christ, your inner sage onto someone else, then you're truly free, right? If anything, that might be the defining step in attaining to spiritual self-sovereignty. So during my own recovery, I reconnected with a couple of Buddhist teachers that I knew, a couple of monks, and got to know many more Buddhist teachers around the world. Spoke to some very senior Buddhist monks, in fact, who I was really surprised had the time to speak with me. But there you go, little old me. They actually had the generosity to pick up the phone and chat with me, which was great. But what I found was that no one had the answers, right? No one had a model of mind that made total sense in line with everything that I'd experienced. And this was no surprise. This is to be expected, right? Because they can merely talk about their own experience. They can't impart truth. And the true sages, in my opinions, were the ones that realized this. What I found was many of the teachers I encountered, not just the ones I spoke to, but people I researched online and whose content I consumed and so on, they often believed that they were drawing the only possible conclusions from their experience. I've experienced this, therefore, this is what the Buddha must have meant by this and so on. When in truth, they were actually doing the opposite. They were superimposing their conclusions onto experience. They were seeing themselves in the world. And the only discourse I could find where this understanding was truly part of the literature and what was being taught was in modern psychology. It's only in modern psychology where I really came across people who understood this fact, that actually what people are seeing is not a truth about the world per se, but they're seeing themselves, they're seeing their own assumptions in the world. As part of this, I rediscovered Carl Jung. I had been into Jung some time ago, but I had to rediscover him to really get to understand the concept of the unconscious and also the process of individuation. I think of individuation as really spiritual growth, essentially. I know that there's nuance to what it means, but essentially, I think of it as just the process of making the unconscious conscious. And I talked about this in the first episode, certainly, and also in the first 3 episodes. So it's really with modern psychology that I was able to understand the principles of what cults are really about. And I realized that there's many different definitions of a cult. And I read books by Stephen Hassan, for example, The Combating Cult Mind Control, which was certainly pivotal in my own recovery. And it became clear that people think about cults in many different ways, which is to be expected. But I really wanted to understand what are the principles at the heart of this cult phenomenon. And so the way I now think of a cult is any group of people that uses undue influence to cultivate and maintain a codependent dynamic between its leaders and its members. So there's a lot of terms in there, each having their own definitions, and we'll get into them. But essentially, it's codependency in groups, right? It can be anything. It can be a family. It can be a workplace. It could even be between 2 people. I think if it's just 2 people, we might just call that a codependent relationship. But essentially, that is the principle. It's a group of people with a leader who is deliberately trying to get their followers to project something onto them using undue influence of behavioral control, information control, thought control, and emotional control to remove people from their center. And of course, doing that by hacking in and manipulating them through their unconscious mind. So speaking of Stephen Hassan, he identifies 4 kinds of cult. He mentions spiritual cult or religious cult, a commercial cult. So this is where there might be some kind of financial incentive or multi-level marketing scheme, a self-help cult, political cult, and I've added here also family and friendship circles, and I might also add workplaces. There's actually an infinite number of kinds of cult, right? Every cult is completely different, of course, but these are some of the main ones and can help guide our detection and our thinking as we try to discern whether the group we are facing up to is indeed a cult or is something actually healthy. So here's a quote from Deborah Layton, who was a survivor of the People's Temple cult. She said that nobody joins a cult. You join a self-help group, a religious movement, a political organization. they change so gradually. By the time you realize you're entrapped, and almost everybody does, you can't figure a safe way back out. That's right, almost everybody does. It's inevitable. If you look at a lot of these cults and the cult leaders themselves and their relationships, they have a half-life, and quite a short half-life often. But by the time one realizes, and they're going through a lot of conflict and maybe even having a clash with the cult leader, it's not as simple as just leaving when you realize. There can be all kinds of ties, all kinds of dangers associated with leaving. One thing I would probably add to this quote by Deborah is that, yes, the cult changes and does so gradually. That's true. Like, there is a deliberate attempt to perform sleight of hand and make it change very gradual. But you know what else is changing is our own perception. It's our own mind that is catching up with what is really going on. As we start to play out our model in reality and realizing it just doesn't fit, right? So it's natural that gradually that model is going to be called into question. And that can be very painful, because that model might be our most precious held possession, right? It's the thing we identify with the most. If someone has committed themselves to a group like this, clearly there's a great reason for doing so. And there's a lot to be lost, it would seem, in the mind of the person doing that. So some examples here, of course, spiritual cult would be things like People's Temple, Scientology, Divine Truth. Now, this is an interesting one. Divine Truth is actually headed up by a guy who claims to be Jesus. So I mention him here because I'm not fully aware of any abuse that's happened. There are anecdotes and things online, but the point is that this is a person that is claiming to be Jesus. And in my view, if a cult leader or a spiritual leader, whoever, is trying to get you to project numinous unconscious content, such as the Christ archetype, onto them, if they're making any attempt to get you to project anything, then make no mistake, that is exploitation. It's to say nothing of what else is going on. It's to say nothing of whether there's physical abuse, sexual abuse, financial abuse and manipulation and deception. I don't have evidence of that. What I do know is that there is an attempt to remove people from their center, and that is not spiritual leadership. That is the opposite of spiritual leadership. That is not respecting people's sovereignty. I sometimes think it'd be funny to get him and my old cult leader on a Zoom call together, but I think that would be quite hard to engineer. I think they'd each find a way of avoiding such a talk, but that would certainly be a valuable discussion, I'm sure, for all involved. Commercial cults include groups like Nexium. Now, I recently became aware of this group, who were very extreme, and it was led by a guy who was branding women and writing his initials on women's bodies and getting them to beg him to do it, right? So they're really quite sinister stuff, because it's like, if they ask him to brand them, can he really be held responsible for that abuse? So this is just rampant egotism, right? This is just complete narcissism. Self-help, the six-figure mentors. I was part of that group, and I won't say too much more about them. I know people that did get quite burnt. I fortunately didn't. I left before I was that involved. I sort of knew something was up. Hustlers University. This is the education platform and community run by Andrew Tate. This is a guy who teaches emotional manipulation techniques for dating. There's evidence of this online, of screenshots of messages he sent women, for example. And, this is clearly not conducive to connection, certainly completely lacking in empathy. It's showing an unwillingness to be transformed and connect with the person you're dealing with. And needless to say, is not conducive to spiritual growth. So whilst it might produce some material results in the short term for oneself, it produces bad results in the long term and doesn't move you any closer to spiritual self-sovereignty. So it's really just a superficial way to approach life. And lastly, political. And I've written here North Korea, because hopefully no one listening to this will be offended if I call North Korea a cult. The cult of Kim Jong-un. This is a quote from the digital marketing cult that I used to belong to, I'm not going to call the guy out. I'm not going to say who said it. I'm just going to read out the quote. And this is his bio. And it says, "My goal is to add more value to your world than you ever dreamed possible." In capital letters. Now, this is the kind of grandiosity that is the hallmark of narcissism. And the reality is that I know people who did not have value added to their world, but had a significant amount of value taken away from their world. Now, where is he on that, right? Does he care about the damage done there? Or is it entirely that person's responsibility? It's all your results. It's all your responsibility. It is true that we're all responsible for our own decisions. But it's a bit of a stretch, don't you think, to say that, therefore, if you fall for my deception, it's your own fault. Now, of course, there is a lesson to be learned in the people affected by that, but that does not exculpate the perpetrators from responsibility. Responsibility is a wonderful thing for anyone to take. And in the world of a narcissist, it's even better when it's other people who are taking it. But regrettably, they don't realize the benefits of taking it oneself. They think that it's all about cajoling the world to fit their needs and regulate their unresolved feelings, which they are not willing to go near. And if only they knew the true growth and benefits that come from actually taking responsibility for one's own intention, speech, and actions. So this is just complete absurd deception. So there are 5 dangers of cult involvement, and this again can help us to break down the risks, understand the risks with greater granularity and what we might be looking for, but also these double up as the ways in which we might become tied to a cult as well. So these 5 dangers, or the 5 ties, are physical, financial, legal, emotional, and spiritual. So these are fairly self-explanatory, but some of these you might not initially expect, like legal danger, for example. This happened with me and my business cult, where the cult leader tried to, well, he did actually sort of get me to be the director, let me enter that situation thinking it was a beneficial thing for me. But then he was also trying to get the company to take out substantial loans, which, he didn't actually have an intention of paying back. So the idea, I think, was to, get Max to be director. And then what I'll do is I'll get him to take out a massive loan. I can then extract that money from the company and leave him with the responsibility to pay it off. Well, thankfully, I didn't fall for that one. But that's an example of how you can get into legal trouble with a cult. The others are hopefully quite self-explanatory, but I'll just go into depth on emotional. This again is through tapping into the unconscious mind. This is a danger, and it's important to face our emotions and work through the feeling. There's arguably no better guide of what it is we need to do than the feeling and the unresolved feelings that are coming up for us. But there is a case for doing that in a deliberate and voluntary, controlled way, rather than pinning our emotions and our emotional well-being on the actions of a cult leader. And lastly, spiritual. There is such a thing as spiritual danger. Now, what I believe is that if you zoom out far enough, you can't really go far wrong. That you can get trapped, you can get spiritually stranded temporarily, but nothing's permanent. You're never going to stay there forever. And the more powerful the trap, the more valuable the lesson, ultimately. But that said, a cult does intend to be a spiritual trap. The whole idea is that they want you to project these inner archetypes of Christ and so on, the hero, onto the leader, preventing you from realizing it in yourself. It is a master-slave dynamic where the leader benefits from sapping your energy and your attention and redirecting it away from things that are actually in your own interests in pursuit of spiritual self-sovereignty. So, God, these cults, they sound pretty bad, right? They sound pretty insidious. How on earth does anyone ever end up joining one of these groups? How is it that cults avoid detection? Well, there's really 3 primary ways that cults avoid detection. And the first is that they provide genuine value, right? We always get something out of joining one of these groups. It might be some kind of spiritual knowledge, techniques for improving the state of your mind to an extent and in certain ways, right? It might be financial tips and tricks. It might be advice for building a business, right? There's usually a lot of genuine value, not to mention the community. Meeting like-minded people who are generally very nice, right? Generally very kind, and you often have a lot of great connection with the other people who are involved in this group. And I've known people that have been very resistant to leaving a cult for no reason other than they felt connected to the community. So they can understand that the leader is actually not who they claim to be, and they're actually very harmful and dangerous, and they can understand that the teachings don't make sense after all either, and are also corrupt and perverse and designed actually on one level to just maintain control over you, test obedience. And in spite of all that, they can remain attached to the cult because they just don't want to leave the people that they're with. They don't want to let people down, right? They're enslaved by their own shadow material. They don't want to be seen as selfish, right? And so the second way in which cults avoid detection is by tapping into the fears and desires of the unconscious mind. If it wasn't for unconscious fears and desires, there would be no cults, right? And you see this playing out in how people just are so resistant to see the reality of the situation, of the cult leader's intentions. I can relate to this. I have first-hand experience of being affected in this way. Like I said, I think everybody does, because we all have an unconscious mind. It's not a mistake. It's not a bad thing. It is, the source of meaning in our lives as much as it is the source of many challenges. But I think you really have to go through an experience like that to really understand the extent to which the unconscious mind can manipulate your decisions and the way you see the world and make it seem like what you're doing is a good idea, when in retrospect it's like it blatantly wasn't. But I think it's important to, as part of one's recovery, to reflect on just how possible it was to be deceived through those fears and desires. Really come to have some respect and understanding of the unconscious mind through that insight. So this really is kind of like the ultimate resource for a cult, and therefore one of our key focus areas in a full recovery from an exploitative cult experience. Third way in which cults avoid detection is kind of simple. It's really about applying undue influence to prevent the spread of awareness. So this is about trying to strike fear into you, either implicitly or explicitly threatening you to not let people know what's going on, make it think that your decision to leave is actually indicative of your unenlightenment or the fact that you're due to be reborn as an animal for countless iterations. Of course, all this really does to the person who is intent on learning and moving on and recovering is further expose the cult's true intentions. They want this to exert influence over people's minds, but really what it does is just they shoot themselves in the foot, because they make it so abundantly clear that they're not really interested in your well-being, because it's the ego that experiences fear, right? If they're trying to use fear to control, they aren't interested in your spiritual growth. Full stop. It's really that simple. As Carl Jung said, where your fear is, there is your task. And so if it's fear generated by the ego that makes you want to stay in a cult, then that might be a clue as to what the productive course of action might be. Cults rely on what is known in Jungian psychology as participation mystique. I mentioned this earlier, and this is really where we're engaging with our own inner unconscious content, but engaging with it through the world. And this can be done knowing that that's what's going on, and it can be done without knowing that that's what's going on. So in the case of a cult experience, generally the person doesn't know that actually when they look up to the leader, or they aspire to this leader, what they're really aspiring to is their own potential, which is appearing now in this impoverished, caricaturial form out there in the world. But again, because our unconscious fears and desires are being tapped into, going back to the previous point, we don't see it for what it really is. We don't want to see the reality, which is actually, in retrospect, once you leave, really quite clear. But because the unconscious mind is involved, it's looking for a way to placate that unresolved unconscious need. So the way I define participation mystique is as follows: a temporary experience of wholeness produced through the engagement with worldly objects, people and symbols onto which numinous personal unconscious content has been projected. So we're all aspiring to wholeness. The psyche is aspiring to wholeness. Our journey here really is a movement towards wholeness. But we get trapped at various points by seeking these ephemeral worldly objects to make us whole. And we mistake the symbol for the real thing. We mistake the idea of love or the image of love for actual love and connection, right? As an example. This is a trap that narcissists and cult leaders are firmly rooted in. And this is why they need to create this perpetual source of validation in order to not go near that dam of feelings that is just waiting to burst the moment they let their guard down. We don't have to go that far. We don't have to subscribe to a fantasy to keep our feelings at bay. But participation mystique is a natural process. And it's a wonderful thing if you know that that's what's going on. And you can engage with your own numinous content through that experience, through that process. But it can also be abused. And this is a defining feature really of cult dynamics, is that, and all kinds of codependent dynamics, is that the perpetrator will actively encourage this process of participation mystique. So as much as cults initially might look like a spiritual vehicle, and they might purport to be able to take you all the way and give you the knowledge to take yourself all the way, they are by definition a spiritual trap, because they are trying to withdraw your personal inner content. So you cannot reach your spiritual or personal growth potential whilst belonging to a cult. Now, they may well teach things that can be useful in a certain context to advancing you to a point, to make the unconscious conscious to a point, but they will always, without fail, neglect to support you in a way that takes you to genuine spiritual self-sovereignty. If they did that, they wouldn't be a cult, because inherent to the way they work is the need for you to project inner aspects of yourself onto the leader. That is not to say that some valuable lessons can't be learned from a cult, but they usually can. That's a large part of why people join them. But their real intention ultimately is to be a trap. And I talk about this in my book, The Cult Recovery Guide. I talk about the 5 phases of cult codependency. And during the 4th phase, which is known as the clash phase, there comes a time when the cult leader or people acting on their behalf are forced to show their hand. Are they really interested in your genuine growth? Or is that merely a cover for what cards they're really holding? What they're really intending to do is to foster a perpetual source of narcissistic supply and keep getting attention from you. Understanding this can be very powerful. So I want to talk now a little bit about some predictions of how cults will continue to evolve. And it really helps to understand these principles of cults, because you are going to encounter groups in the future that do not have your best interests at heart. You're going to encounter countless individuals that do not have your best interests at heart. And yet they will purport to have just that in mind. Understanding merely what groups look like, merely what cults do, this is useful, but really we want to be understanding the principles of cults, that essentially it is just a codependent dynamic. It's operating at a group level, and that the way in which that plays out will certainly morph and change over time. Now, with my relatively recent experience of being part of a Buddhist cult, which, as much as it did involve a lot of face-to-face contact in my case, was mostly an online cult. I call these digital cults. Certainly over the last couple of years, as more and more people have worked from home, we've started to see a lot of these cults move online and new cults form online. One thing to watch out for here is that, of course, being online, there's limits on how they can control you, and there's limited physical control they can have. They can't force you to do anything physically. But, often in control dynamics, that doesn't actually matter so much, right? If there is a compelling thought and emotional control narrative, like if you buy into the vision, if you believe that something terrible is going to happen to you if you don't follow through on the cult's aims, it doesn't matter, right? They can control your behavior through controlling the narrative. And so one thing to watch out for is very heavy-duty thought and emotional control narratives, because these become of higher relative importance. As part of that, all forms of dark psychology, so this includes gaslighting, misdirection, sort of saying one thing but really trying to misdirect away from something else, any form of deception, it's a red flag. If anyone tries to pull over the wool over your eyes, even once, be very, very cautious, I would say. And I would even expand that to include any attempt whatsoever to remove you from your center, to remove you from your pursuit of wholeness. This is something I am very sensitive to. This is why I can very easily detect someone who maybe I wouldn't consider them a full-fledged narcissist, but if they're trying to decenter me in even a subtle way, I'm likely to reconsider my relationship with that person, because that's someone who clearly doesn't have my best interests at heart and is trying to use me in some capacity to not go near their own unresolved issues. So this is not someone who's practicing what I would call habit 1 and habit 2 of the 7 habits of individuation. In other words, they're not taking responsibility for their own mind, and they're not cultivating compassion. This is very common in Western culture, Western circles. We think that, it's great, right, if we just go out there and exert our power on the world and our will on people and prove how great and competent and valuable we are. But we fail to be compassionate in the process, right? We want other people to be below us so that we can be higher, right? And this is a flagrant way of advertising that really one isn't interested in growth at all. They're just merely acting it out. So I think one thing to be careful of here is that with a lot of cults going online, these kinds of control techniques are going to be employed more discreetly than ever, more slowly and carefully over long periods of time. And I've seen this in action. I've seen just how insidious the game plan of a cult leader can be. But don't overestimate them. They make a lot of mistakes. It's primarily in one's own unwillingness to see the mistakes that they don't get seen. But once you face up to the fact and really resolve that tension of not wanting to see them the way they really are, or the way they're really behaving, you start to notice that actually they make mistakes all the time, and they end up falling on their own sword inevitably because of it. I want to highlight a few subtle and covert tactics that you're more likely to see in the cults of today and tomorrow. Things such as claiming they're not a cult because they don't do this, or they don't do X, Y, Z kind of undue influence. We don't force people. We don't commit sexual abuse. We don't lock people up. Therefore, we can't be a cult, right? It's like, I think that's somewhat unconvincing. If you don't mention all the other kinds of undue influence that you are doing, the information control, the fear of what will happen to you if you leave or if you don't practice these teachings, the attempt to remove you from your center and get you to project that inner content onto them. If they're like leaving little clues, right, as to their attainments and who they think they are, that's no more sophisticated than just outright saying it, in my opinion. Like, it doesn't really make it any more noble to to imply it, right, than it is to just say it. So if there's anything like that, if there's any form of undue influence at all, it's a cult. Stating that everything is your responsibility. Okay, so we touched on this. There's nuance here. Habit 1 of the 7 habits is to take responsibility for your mind. But that does not mean that other people don't need to take responsibility for their minds, and that if they do harm to you, that it's your own fault. It's not really like that, right? It's not. There's a middle way to this understanding. It's not like black and white. Okay, making implicit allusions to the leader's attainment. This is like dropping little breadcrumbs or clues just to sort of try and get you to think that there's someone special. The prevalence of stock material for preemptive objection handling. So like if they've published a series of blog posts or articles that sort of address many of the common concerns. So like, as an example, my old Buddhist cult leader used to do this a lot. And he once wrote a post that said something like, the traditional Buddhist teachers will not understand him. So this is really a way of trying to objection handle the fact that none of them take them seriously. Yeah. So it's like trying to spin that as somehow positive. Now, it does that without even addressing why it might not be a positive. So it's one thing to spin it as a positive, but for it to really be convincing, you also have to say why what they're saying isn't actually valid, right? You can't merely just like try and misdirect. You actually have to explain, like if you really want to convince someone. If you find them having to rely on that kind of misdirection rather than an honest, genuine explanation, then that's culty behavior, I would say. Lastly here, ostentatious humility. So this is trying to present themselves as overly humble or maybe even generous or in any way at all, right? Genuine spiritual leaders don't need to do any of this stuff. They don't need to objection handle. They don't need to spin things around on people. They don't need to pretend to be humble. They don't need to act humble. They just do it, right? They just be humble. They don't need to sort of try and present an image of anything. It's just some more sort of subtle things there to be on the lookout for. Okay, I'm going to end this podcast just by pointing you in the direction of the ebook that I wrote. This is the Cult Recovery Guide. And I go into many of these topics in much greater depth in that book. It's an 80-page ebook, so you can read it, pretty quickly. And many people who have read it so far have said it's been a good read, so that's nice to hear. By all means, give your feedback, and you can get a copy at makeitconscious.com/free guide. So this has been a talk on cults, what really is a cult, understanding the principles that define a cult, not merely what they look like. And I hope this has given you some extra tips to put up your sleeve when it comes to discerning whether the group you are encountering is a wholesome, healthy group that has your best interests at heart, or whether it is indeed an exploitative cult. So in the next episode, we're going to delve deeper into narcissism and cult leaders as part of that, and what's really going on there. And again, that can help give us further tools to identify that phenomenon. But for now, I'm going to leave that there. I hope that was useful, and I shall speak to you next time.